Ruler School is brought to you by Odyssey Games, where you can go to pre-order upcoming Force of Will sets, ccgprime.com for singles and supplies, cardodoko.com for those rulers in the international market looking for product, the Ruler School Circuit Series now taking orders on our Q3 2024 circuit kits, and our guest lecturer members, Fight Ramen. Class is in session.
Hey there guys, welcome back to Ruler School TCG with yours truly, Paul Reisman. Today we are talking about Lucie, the synthetic alchemist. This is a guide to play Lucie because in my experience, Lucie is one of the most difficult rulers I have ever played. She's super complicated, she has a lot of different moving pieces, and keeping all of those pieces straight can be difficult. It can also be hard to understand how to play her sometimes because she has so many moving pieces. So today we're just breaking that down. This is going to be first of two guides that we're going to be doing for some of the rulers in Thoth of the Trinity. The other one being Utsune's, who is also incredibly complicated. So we are doing a couple of guides to kind of help people figure things out. This is kind of an extension of the Force of Will yearbook series that we did a couple years ago. And so this is more of a current class situation, not really a yearbook situation. So how do you play Lucie, right? What's the game plan? The game plan is to recognize that Lucie is a ruler focused on maintaining her hand advantage while paying very little will for her effects, right? As you see some of her cards, you're going to recognize that the purpose of Lucie as a ruler is just to make things cheaper, to make them free, or even just to make your opponent feel like they can't even do anything against you, which is kind of the purpose of her deck in general. So the real thing you're going to have to recognize is that at some point you are going to want to play different synthetic spirits for different scenarios. Most often the light synthetic spirit or the darkness synthetic spirit. And knowing which one for which situation is going to be important for you to know. More often than not, probably about 75% of the time in the current metagame, in which there's not a lot of stuff going to be on the field, you're going to be wanting to play the light spirit, for instance, right? So knowing when to pivot and change that game plan is really important in your matchups. The goal of the deck is to have more resources than your opponent in general, and in that way she's very similar to Lian and her treasures. Although Lian has to pay for her treasures to go onto the chase, most of the time Lucie doesn't need that. She just has a bunch of free effects, which is why she gets so much extra will to play with. You do generally play less will than your opponent, and oftentimes you play on their turn. So in that way you're very similar to a control deck. You're playing things on your opponent's turn to gain more advantage and to thin out your deck in a way that is a little bit slower than something like Lian would be playing. However, you're getting more specific things. You're not drawing a bunch of cards. You're getting specific cards out of your deck. And so for that reason, I consider her to be a more economy-focused play style. She's going to be really good against defensive decks, but not very strong against aggressive decks. But she has a really good late game push that involves either her flipping or just playing a really large resonator like Sphinx or Electra, etc., which you will see a little bit later on in the video. So who is Lucie? What are we talking about here? You got to start with the ruler first, because then it kind of makes a little bit more sense as to how the game is going to begin. So Lucie has a lot of really good effects that are going to help you guard naturally against any form of aggression. So that's really helpful. As an economy-based ruler, having the ability to slow down aggression is very, very helpful. And most notably, this aggression is based out of field aggression. So if your opponent is playing a bunch of resonators and they're swinging in and trying to deal you damage, Lucie is going to be able to guard against that pretty well most of the time, because she's going to have synthetic spirits that she can put into the field, right? When you eventually meet her judgment condition, which is 5 different named synthetic spirits in your item area, she will flip into a very strong control style J ruler who can tuck different cards, very similar to linkage, which we will get into a little bit later, but you can basically tuck cards from your item area back into your deck in order to activate specific abilities, one of which is just a natural reanimation. The second of which I think is the most powerful, is just a way to expel cards from the game in general. Short of untouchable, that's a lot of cards in the game. So if you're able to just take that card and just put it outside of the game for your opponent to never use again, that's really, really good. And then she can just flood the field if you want to link 3 away, which is really, really helpful. Lucie in general, you know, she's got some pretty mediocre stats, but there's ways to buff that. And when you flip her, she should be hard for your opponent to manage and deal with. I'm finding myself flipping her more often as I learn that the flip is not only incredibly achievable if you know how to do it right, but it can also just seal games in general once you make it happen. Her companion in crime is the test tubes. The test tubes are really good because they buff your field, they buff your elemental comma spirits when you have a witch J ruler. So you have to have a flipped Lucie in order for that buff to take effect. Just keep that in mind. I definitely misread that when I first started playing this card. It's not that good. It's much more balanced than that. So just be aware. It's solid though, especially in the late game. You can tuck 3 to bring back a whole bunch of synthetic spirits, and all of a sudden they're getting a buff from the test tubes. So this is definitely one of the really powerful, uninteractable cards of support that Lucie has. You can also discard an elemental comma spirit to find any spirit off the top 2 cards that you reveal. So this could be Fiola all the way up to your other synthetic spirits, including your homunculus. It just is a spirit. It does not care if it's an elemental comma spirit or something with synthetic spirit in its name. And you can do this on both players' turns. So this is a really good way of dumping your synthetic spirits to the graveyard to use with alchemic research later. And then it can cheat a 2-cost elemental comma spirit into the field by just tapping it. This can be done during your upkeep or even on your opponent's turn to get a search as you go into your turn. That's typically how I've been playing the card, mostly because then it's just basically a free body on the field, which then allows me to have more magic stones going into my opponent's turn and interacting with them in that way. It's just really helpful to not have to be too proactive with Lucie. It's because of things like test tubes that you're going to see why Lucie doesn't have to use stones for really good defensive effects. Test tubes is very good for that, plus it continues to offer you resources that you can put onto the field or discard to find other resources, just like the synthetic spirits. Synthetic spirits are also going to be ways in which you maintain advantage. They basically cantrip for one another. The light spirit is probably the best spirit, frankly, because it doesn't really care if your opponent has things to hit or to destroy or to deal damage to or to bounce. It just sort of gains you life, which is honestly in some ways very helpful in a deck that is weak to aggression. So synthetic spirits are really powerful in the sense that if they do get stacked, they grant their effects to the thing that is stacked above them. Notably, this is going to be your homunculus, and you'll see why in the next slide. This synthetic spirit will search for anything with synthetic spirit in their name. So that is synthetic spirits 1 through 5, including 0, which is your homunculus. There's another card in the game that allows you to link 5 away for a homunculus in your deck. You don't even need that card because your synthetic spirits just find it anyway. So in a lot of ways, the synthetic spirits are looking for your board wipe at any time you need it. They are also looking for anything from the deck that can help you to fuel your engine. And then when they're on the field, and which is specific on the field, the CR is referenced in the actual slide here. So in case you are needing to be able to tell people where this is, in the rules itself, because this doesn't specify where it happens, unlike in other card games where this may not be the case, this is only in reference to the field. So they have to be in the field in order for you to use their alchemic research effects. And those are free. Basically, you are taking something from your graveyard that's a synthetic spirit, for cost, putting it into your item area. Then you get the effect. So it's going to be very hard for your opponent to prevent you from loading up your item area because it's all cost based. That's a huge advantage for what Lucie wants to do. Honestly, the effect for alchemic research is kind of just gravy. The cost is like the real benefit here, which is weird to say out loud in a lot of ways. It's usually not the case. But Lucie definitely benefits from just playing a bunch of these, having some in graveyard, and then using all of their alchemic research effects to varying effects. You can only do once per turn, so just be aware about that, but you can do it once on any player's turn, which is really helpful. Because of Lucie's ability, this thing has to be attacked before you can be attacked by your opponent in any other way, right? So your synthetic spirits cannot be on the field if your opponent wants to attack you, is essentially what her card reads. And if they're going into the graveyard anyway, that's really helpful for you, because then you can just play another one later on and use their alchemic research effect. So it's really helpful for that reason. Slows your opponent down, but also puts your opponent in a situation in which they don't want them on the field, but they also don't want them off the field. It's what a weird catch-22 that your opponent is in because of these little guys. You need to understand linkage as well. This is another one of her base effects for her more potent alchemical everything's. Whether it's her magic or whether it's her homunculus, linkage is there to help you make those cards cheaper and easier to make. So the thing about linkage that's really interesting, and we have all of the references here from the CR to help you do that. Basically, you are tucking cards from your item area back into the deck to reduce the cost of any of the different attributes in the card. You're doing that to reduce the cost of the card to make it cheaper to play. And you can choose multiple of the same attribute if you want to. In this scenario with the homunculus here, you're not going to be doing multiple attributes, but for another card we're about to see, that might be the case. So the synthetic spirit here is definitely what you're going to be using linkage for 95% of the time, unless you're playing some sort of spell version, which I don't think is quite viable in the current environment. But it is a thing you can do. But the homunculus here is really strong because when it enters, if you control a witch J/ruler, so either side of Lucie, basically it destroys all the other resonators and then it sucks up a bunch of synthetic spirits, draws you a bunch of cards, and then it gains the Trinity effect, where you can do alchemic research twice per turn, or tuck 2 cards from underneath the card back into the deck in order to be unblockable for the turn. Where this is relevant is all of your synthetic spirits, when they're stacked underneath him, will grant their effects to him. So now he has the gain life ability, the burn 6 ability, the destroy a resonator ability, the bounce anything that's not a resonator or a magic stone ability, and the will production ability. So he's going to have a lot of value depending on what stuff you have stacked beneath him, and he can do 2 alchemic researches a turn as a result. So he's kind of a useful endgame tool for Lucie. I would not call him the win condition of the deck, though. That's something you have to fashion outside of her core support. The other piece to Lucie that is not quite in play yet, but we might see that with future releases, is Alchemy Chance. Alchemy Chance are very similar to the big boy homunculus because they do have linkage. And they're going to be doing really powerful effects depending on the different kinds of attributes on the cards that you use for linkage, right? In at least the case of Helios Trismegistus. Otherwise, the linkage effects are there to just make these kinds of cards cheaper. These chants are kind of sparse in usage right now. The best one by far is Helios Trismegistus, and I would call it a sideboard card at best, mostly because it can remove all cards and all graveyards from the game face down, which makes it so that your opponent can't reference them for things like solarization, etc. So it's kind of like expelling, but in a very different way, and I think that's probably the most use this card has in the current environment. There might be more Alchemy Chance to come, though, so just be aware. I mean, Lucie is one of the main protagonists of this cluster, and so I would anticipate that she is going to be learning all kinds of alchemic magic throughout this cluster. So keep your eyes out for more Alchemy Chance as we go forward. Let's talk about some of the late game threats. Now that we have sort of the early and mid game scenarios figured out, you're going to be tossing cards to test tubes, using the cards that you threw into the graveyard to fuel free effects on your opponent's turn, meaning that you are going to have a ton of will available to you as the game goes on. Sometimes you may not even cast a thing because you have so many free effects available to you. What does that mean then? It means that, you know, on turns 3, 4, even 5, you could be playing something large like Sphinx on your opponent's turn, which is a really sticky resonator and it's really hard to get rid of. It's got barrier of cost 1 or less, and it's got flying and drain, so you can be gaining a whole bunch of life and potentially even stacking up board buffs on your board, so that your elemental spirits are even larger when Lucie finally flips. Electra is also a potentially good option if you want to focus more on the Alchemy Chant, 2 Friends and a Cat. For some reason, either in your sideboard or your main board, Electra might slot in very well as a means of supporting that. We do have the red synthetic spirit, which, you know, can give stones like your Alexandrite magic stone access to red relatively easily. And so she's a really powerful card that can deal 16 to the board and then deal 16 to your opponent and then swing in for 16 more. Since they can't cast or do anything for the most part, 80% of the time that's going to happen. So Electra, still a very strong late game push. We also have a classic control style card in Magic Stone Research Institute, meaning your stone base is going to have to be pretty varied, but that's not too difficult to do and still have consistent will production for the colors that you need. It also means that everything on your board is just going to get bigger, not just your synthetic spirits, but things like some of the support cards we're seeing a little bit in the next slide will also get larger. And then it can allow you to remove your opponent's graveyard, which is sometimes really helpful for you to do. Although I imagine in this deck, you're probably calling for stone every single turn. That might be a little bit more difficult for you to achieve. However, we also have an auto inclusion, I think, in pretty much every sideboard at this point, Replicant Shiva. Replicant Shiva is very interesting because not only can it be a source of removal that doesn't target, it can also buff any of your synthetic spirits that you have on the field. And so now you have this really insulated board that is getting this buff from Shiva. Anytime Shiva kills something, they get even bigger, and it can be an out to any time your opponent wants to stick something on the field and do effects as a result of that. So Shiva can be really powerful, and it can be even a tertiary win condition that you don't even need to use deck space for. She's just very powerful for her own thing. The real issue with Shiva is that if you're playing up against Leon, she is going to be really hard to get onto the field because you cannot solarize. But again, you're in a deck that does not need to use a lot of magic stones, so she might even still be usable in that way. Other support includes Fiola, which is something I mentioned a little bit earlier. She is a spirit, so you can find her off of test tubes. She's got a really nice effect to tuck a card from the chase back onto the bottom of your opponent's deck. Can be relevant sometimes. I really do like Fiola though, because she has the ability to put 4+1/+1 counters on Lucie, taking her from a 7-10 to an 11-14, which is not small stats by any measure. So definitely check that out. You connect those +1/+1 counters with something like a Sphinx stat buff, and you're doing some good work. You're obviously also playing Cursed Mirror because that's one of the best blue cards that's been printed to date, and it's available to Lucie because she is a water ruler with Judgment. There's a lot of things she can do with this card that some others just can't do. Spirit of the Mirage Ruins is also a very good card for her. It's an elemental spirit, So that means that you can use things like your green synthetic spirit to produce will that can be used to play this card for free, essentially, right? Which is really, really helpful. This card is really good against particular decks that like to cheat things in. It gets rid of those cards by expelling them, and so this is really helpful in some regards. I play a couple copies personally, and then I also play a couple copies of Falchion. Sometimes it's really good to just have a discard outlet to get rid of certain cards in your hand. You're going to be seeing Falchion a lot in these couple of guides, I'll tell you what. This card is a lot better than I think a lot of people give it credit for. Very, very solid card in general. Other support cards include Vacuous to just get rid of problematic things that are on your opponent's field. Lucie is unique in that she can run Shackles of Ice in the main board and not be touched by it. It doesn't touch you at all. It doesn't hit sub-rulers. Lucie has no activate abilities on her front side. And so it's just really good for slowing down certain decks like Leon that do have activate abilities and rely on those effects in order to get ahead of you. Hydria is a really good way of stalling your opponent out of drawing more cards than you. It's very good for that particular reason. Plus, if someone uses Hydria on you, in general, you're going to be using Hydria as you can only draw one card per turn, but all of Lucie's abilities do not require you to draw. So that's really helpful as well. Outside of the homunculus, you're not drawing any other cards except for the one card you draw per turn. So you're still able to amass advantage without drawing cards. Setting the stage for Providence is also here. This is kind of a good way of insulating your plans against things like Curse Mirror of the Snake or other things that are untouchable that are seeking to interact with your chase. It's also just a really good filter, right? You can just cast this card if you don't need it and you just draw you a card, which can be really helpful in some instances. Otherwise, if you're playing against the control matchup, this is just one more way to punish what your opponent is trying to do to you. You also have cards like Ray Asnable. Not that card. You also have cards like Ray Asnable, Muse Staring At, Perfect Loki, and Liberation of the Waters is really good tertiary support. Ray Asnable is really good in the situations in which you need to stop an enter effect. He slots very well into this deck, and you can cast him for 3 relatively easily. He is a little proactive though, so you might want to be careful as to when you actually play him. Muse Staring At, also a very good card, insulates against things like Mirror or cards that are reduced in their cost, trying to interact with you, which is really helpful. Your graveyard can get a little hefty sometimes, so playing something like Perfect Loki to make sure your opponent gets a minus X effect, which can make it so that you get around things like Eternal, or just make it so that Imperishable on your opponent's J-Ruler doesn't really matter all that much. Perfect Loki can be really useful for that. And then of course Liberation of the Waters. You might get things RFG'd. Well, what if I want them back in my deck? Liberation of the Waters is here for that. It's a good way of tucking things back in. Popping your own synthetic spirits can be relevant if you need to get rid of your opponent's sticky resonators or their sticky J-Ruler. Liberation can be really strong for that. And so maybe a couple copies in the main or even in the sideboard can be really helpful for you going ahead. So what are some of the strengths of the deck? You might be able to intuit a lot of them because we've been talking and referencing them throughout the video, but generally Lucie just leverages free effects that can really set the opponent back and can further your own win condition, which is really, really helpful. We also need to recognize that water, for the first time in a very long time, has relevant support that takes it into a completely different dimension of playability. Water received really, really powerful support cards and has been slowly over the years been accumulating those cards. Now is Water's time to shine. It also has a lot of effects. This particular deck, it has a lot of effects that dodge Mirror, but it also has effects that use very little will on her own turn. So if you're dedicated to playing on your opponent's turn, you're going to have a ton of will available to you at any given time. And because of that, the deck really enjoys will sinks, in theory. We don't have a lot of will sinks in the game anymore. Those were kind of something that every once in a while they'll crop up. I don't know of anything in blue that really counts in that way. But if we ever get a card that loves you having additional will, Lucie is going to be a deck that utilizes it very well. So weaknesses though, and you know, I love this deck to death, but there are some things. The obvious weakness being if you can't play the deck because it's too complicated, that can be a huge hindrance, but hopefully this guide will mitigate that weakness. If your opponent is dedicated to getting rid of your synthetic spirits and prevents them from sticking into the field, you can really stall the deck and make it difficult. That train, if it's interrupted, might be difficult for you to reestablish depending on what you're trying to do. If your opponent has a deck that just out-economies you, which is definitely not a real word, but I made it up just for the sake of this video. For instance, Leon can be really difficult to deal with this deck. If you don't have a way of slowing her down or preventing her from activating her effects, the deck can be really difficult to beat. And other decks like this can be difficult to beat. So you need ways to slow their economy down so your economy can take off. It can also really suffer against burn aggression. Putting cards on the field can be a little difficult for Lucie to deal with, although she has a built-in mechanism to handle that relatively easy because you have to attack her synthetic spirits before anything else happens. However, if your opponent decides to go the burn route, that's where things maybe get a little bit more difficult. I would sideboard accordingly or even mainboard accordingly if you're anticipating a lot of burn in your current metagame. It can also be really difficult to perform Judgment. Judgment for Lucie is definitely a late game affair, and it requires you to have synthetic spirits with different names lined up in your item area, which can at times be difficult to achieve unless you deck build and prioritize your gameplay accordingly. Other than that, though, I think Lucie has a lot of potential despite these weaknesses. If you know how to use the deck and you know how to play to her strengths and mitigate her weaknesses, the deck is very strong and has a lot of potential, I think. We're just not seeing her being played because some people have deemed her a little bit too complicated or just not quite good enough. Hopefully someone will prove them wrong. So definitely, viewer, take this deck and do something really interesting with it. Do you have any questions? Let us know down in the comment section down below. I definitely don't think I am the Lucie expert. I definitely have been playing the deck a lot and I've had learned a lot about this deck, but I definitely don't have the market cornered on knowledge. So let us know if there's something that I didn't add in that you think should have been added in. Let us know down in the comment section down below. Give the video a like. If you like guides like this, definitely let us know because we can do more for different rulers depending on what you're asking for. And if you are not subscribed, hit subscribe and ring that bell, man. You gotta do it if you want more content like this from all of us here at Ruler School TCG. With all that being said, this has been Paul. Class is dismissed.